Hey, this is Poro from the future, and I just want to clarify on some of the pronunciation mistakes that you'll hear in the video. So, I pronounced Priscilla as Priscilla, I pronounced Archdragon Peak as Archdragon Peak, there was one occasion where I called Seath Sith, and I messed up the two knights' names by calling them Ciaran and Go instead of Kieran and Goff. So for those, I either left them alone if I said their name like 50 times, in which case I'm just assuming that you guys know what I'm talking about. And then for some of the ones that I butchered really badly, I just resaid their names and then threw in the clip over top of it. So it'll sound a little bit weird when you get there, but that's why. Hi, Poro here with a bit of a different type of video. I'm always fascinated with the lore of video games, and the From Software series has some of the best lore out there out of any game I have ever witnessed. However, the game is heralded for its combat and boss design, with the lore often being overlooked or only focused on by a minority of the community. As such, I wanted to create a ranking list for every boss in Dark Souls, but with the only requirement being the lore of the boss. I don't care about the boss design in the slightest, nor do I care about whether the boss itself fairly represents the lore that it was based on. All I care about is the lore itself. I also have the bosses split into separate tiers, and I'll label those as they come up. Finally, this goes without saying, but this video has huge spoilers for not only Dark Souls 1, but some spoilers for Dark Souls 2 and 3. If you don't want any of those games to be spoiled, I highly recommend you wait to watch this video. With that, I'll kick it off with number 27. In 27th, and the only boss in Dark Souls 1 granted the prestigious title of F tier, we have the Sanctuary Guardian. I was really upset that this thing was dead last, but trust me, I tried everything I could and pulled out every stop I had in an attempt to pull this guy into a higher tier. Nothing worked. Every possible theory I had ended with a contradiction. The first idea I toyed around with had to do with the lion nature of the Sanctuary Guardian paired with the lightning powers it has. I figured maybe there was a potential connection between Ornstein and the Guardian, such as Ornstein stationing the Guardian there to protect the Ulasil Sanctuary. If I follow this idea, then it leads me to believe that Ornstein would have some form of connection with Ulasil's Sanctuary, and the only connector there would be Dusk. Dusk does mention being saved by a knight that she quote-unquote believes to be Artorias. The theory in question would have been whether the knight that saved her from the abyss was actually Ornstein, which would give Ornstein the connection he needs to want to station a guardian there to protect the sanctuary. However, this completely falls flat when we realize that the knight in question was actually the player character, and Dusk simply mistook us for Artorias. If the Sanctuary Guardian was not created or purposed by Ornstein to protect the Sanctuary, then that means the Guardian must have existed independently of Ornstein. After all, the only thing connecting Ornstein to Ulasil apart from the Guardian is the presence of the other three Knights of Gwen in the area while Ornstein was absent. So now we know that the Sanctuary Guardian was present on its own accord. The second potential area of lore would be that Ornstein saw the Sanctuary Guardian as a muse or an idol at some point, and based his persona and armor around the Guardian. However, the only ties to this are lightning and the lion, and then this would call into question why Ornstein would neglect the nature of the spikes on the tail, or the poison. Most likely, Ornstein had nothing to do with the Guardian, and the lion and lightning are merely a coincidence. Now that all the ties have been severed between the Guardian and the mainline story, the real problem of the boss shows up. There is absolutely no incentive for the Sanctuary Guardian to be guarding the Sanctuary. Unlike other guards or protectors in the game, Sanctuary Guardian has no hints or ties to it being made by any gods or outside factors, which means that for all we know, it was not purposed to protect the Sanctuary. We also know that it can't be a coincidence that the Sanctuary Guardian is there, because it wouldn't be named the Sanctuary Guardian if it wasn't the Guardian of the Sanctuary. As such, what we are left with is that the Sanctuary Guardian is guarding the Sanctuary because of seemingly no reason or incentive, and with zero ties to any other characters or storylines. Unfortunately, this means the Guardian is a walking contradiction that introduces a handful of problems and answers nothing, granting it the sole F tier and the worst lore boss of Dark Souls 1. The next four bosses belong to the D tier, and in 26th, I present to you the Centipede Demon. My general idea of a D tier boss is that the boss simply exists as a byproduct of the world it's in, and the events that occurred within the lore, but that the boss provides no actual meaning or significance when standing alone. In the case of the Centipede Demon, this guy is a byproduct of Ceaseless Discharge's lore and simply acts as an expansion of him. The only reason why we need to encounter the Centipede Demon at all is to obtain the ring that it was supposedly made out of when the Witch of Isolith failed to recreate the first flame. The Centipede Demon makes perfect sense for what it is, but provides nothing on its own to justify a higher placement. Similarly, 25th and 24th are shared by two bosses, the Capra Demon and the Taurus Demon. These demons are lower demons that can be viewed as the equivalent to basic enemies, with the lore that they were byproducts of failures to recreate the first flame. What pushes these two demons above the Centipede are the loose theories that surround their presence in the Undead Burg, which could potentially point towards them being purposefully placed there to halt the progress of the potential Chosen Undead. However, these claims have little merit and are no more than speculation. At the end of the day, these two bosses could be viewed as nothing more than an expansion on the world building and lore of the Lost Izalith. In 23rd, and maybe sparking some controversy, is Black Dragon Calamity. I feel that people hold Black Dragon Calamity to a very high regard, but I think that most of this is due to how he was From Software's first successful attempt at a dragon boss fight. When you dive into his full lore, it turns out that his sole purpose was mainly being used as a tool by Cath, which means that his lore directly ties into amplifying Manus' lore. If we look at the lore itself, Calamity was a dragon who was credited with some of the destruction of Ulasil, and the presence of this dragon was able to convince the citizens of Ulasil that they needed to search for a greater power to ward the dragon away. This desire for power led the citizens to believe in Cath when he said to unearth Manus, and Manus was the ultimate reason why Ulasil fell to ruin. Calamity himself has no actual significance or motives behind choosing Ulasil to decimate. Had Calamity been manipulated by Cath or chose Ulasil with his own conscious decisions, then he would be a higher rank. However, the way Calamity is written, it comes off more as a dragon simply laying blind destruction to the area around it, and Ulasil happens to just be the area in which Calamity resides. In other words, Calamity is a dragon doing normal dragon things, which is why I view him as a D tier. Moving into the C tier, we have bosses whose lore either has plot significance that grants it some merit on its own, or directly amplifies another boss's lore through its own purpose or chosen actions. Tying in at number 22 and 21 is the Iron Golem and Bell Gargoyles. Both bosses were created by the gods to defend specific checkpoints in the journey of the Chosen Undead, with the Bell Gargoyles being stationed at the first Spell of Awakening, and the Iron Golem stationed to block the entrance of Anor Londo. It should be noted that there are a few minor differences between the two. The Gargoyles are seemingly made for the sole purpose of testing the worth of the Chosen Undead, which would ultimately be a net positive for the mission of the Chosen Undead due to them being strong enough to pass the test. The Iron Golem, on the other hand, seems to be made by separate gods with the opposite intent, and the Iron Golem is a defender made from the god's fear of being slain, and exists only to end the quest of the Chosen Undead. It should also be noted that the Bell Gargoyles have no specific details on being able to be regenerated or reset, which adds lore significance by proving that we are the first Chosen Undead to reach the first Spell of Awakening, whereas the Iron Golem can in fact be reset, as we know characters such as Tarkus and Lautrec have already defeated the Golem. Whether these differences are enough to push one above the other is up to you. In 20th is our good boy, the Asylum Demon. The Asylum Demon, like the Iron Golem and Bell Gargoyles, were specifically stationed by a higher power to test or defeat the Chosen Undead. Asylum Demon, unlike the previous two, was actually expanded upon with some extra cool lore tidbits. For starters, Asylum Demon is directly tied to Oscar of Astora, as we are given our Estus flasks due to Oscar being killed by it. Asylum Demon is also explicitly tied to Velka, who is the driving force behind the quest of the Chosen Undead. I would assume the Bell Gargoyles are tied to Velka as well, but I saw nothing directly pointing this out. Either way, the ties to NPC storylines is enough for me to push Asylum Demon up higher. In 19th is Moonlight Butterfly. It would be first, but sadly we know that Moonlight Butter doesn't fly, and therefore this boss sucks. On a serious note, Moonlight Butterflies are essentially a creation of Seath, with their specific task being to go out and act upon Seath's will, whether this be by capturing entities for experimentation or fetching research materials. The Moonlight Butterfly we encounter in Darkroot Garden is special due to its location and possession of a boss soul. The Moonlight Butterflies we encounter later do not have boss souls, and I think that there is actual lore significance in one of two ways. The Moonlight Butterfly in Darkroot Garden is directly blocking the path to the Divine Ember, which is an item that is beneficial to the Chosen Undead. Seath most definitely realized through his pursuit of knowledge that rekindling the flame would involve his death, so he would be incentivized to do anything to block attempts of the Chosen Undead. Placing his experiments in places where key items or locations are would make perfect sense. The boss soul of the Moonlight Butterfly could have one of two explanations due to this. The first is that Seath gifted extra power to that specific Moonlight Butterfly due to the significance of what it was protecting. The other explanation is that the Moonlight Butterfly collected power over its long stay at the Darkroot Garden due to the plants we can see it eating mid-fight to replenish its power. The 18th place boss, Gaping Dragon, also has similar ties to Seath. Unlike the Moonlight Butterfly, Gaping Dragon is confirmed to be a real dragon that is a descendant of everlasting dragons and not just one of Seath's experiments. However, we are also told that the dragon gained its appearance due to its eternal hunger. I believe this part to be false and only a speculation from legends. The reason why is due to the dragon scale that we find at the bottom of the cliff in the bonfire entrance to Blighttown. This scale means that the gaping dragon climbed up from Blighttown before we fought it in-game, which is cool and all, but it begs the question, why is Gaping Dragon in Blighttown to begin with? If the story that Gaping Dragon got its chest teeth because of insatiable hunger, then there is no reason whatsoever that the dragon would just be chilling around Blighttown when we find it. If you go a step further and apply Seath's motives to stop the Chosen Undead, then you can reach the conclusion that Gaping Dragon was actually a direct result of Seath's experiments, and all of a sudden it makes perfect sense why the dragon is where it is. The evidence that Seath and the Gaping Dragon are related is from the channeler present in the area. The Gaping Dragon holds the key to Blighttown, and Blighttown is directly in the path of the second Bell of Awakening. We also know that the second Bell of Awakening is highly forgotten, and this would be something that Seath definitely uncovered during his quest for research. The idea built here now is that the Gaping Dragon was a descendant of the everlasting dragons that Seath experimented on for the purpose of acting as an obstacle to the second Bell, presenting a Chosen Undead for potentially killing Seath in the future. It's basically a more developed version of the Moonlight Butterfly. 17th belongs to the beautiful Ceaseless Discharge. This guy is the only known son of the Witch of Isolith and was born with sores all over his body. He was given the orange charred ring to help relieve his pain, but he dropped it and eventually became the Centipede Demon. When the son was turned into a demon himself, the sores he had embodied the demon he would become, with giant sores being the main feature of the design. The only comfort in his life remaining is guarding the grave of one of his sisters. There really isn't too much to the lore here, but it is an independent story that holds its own while simultaneously adding to the story of the Lost Isolith, which merits a middle-of-the-pack placement. The story itself is tragic, but I can't take it too seriously because of how goofy it is that the guy dropped the ring. How do you even let that happen? Continuing the trend of Isolith bosses, in 16th we have Chaos Witch Quilaag. Quilaag actually has quite a developed individual story. When the other sisters and the Witch of Isolith herself were all consumed by the Chaos Flame, Quilaag and one of her sisters were far away enough that they were able to flee Isolith. However, both Quilaag and her sister were still half transformed in demons before they could escape, leading to the spider-like lower half on both. They eventually traveled to Blighttown, where they would stay. The sister pledged her life to helping the people of Blighttown against Quilaag's wishes, which is what would lead her into her blindness, as well as the heavily deteriorated and weak body. In fact, the sister can be killed with 1 or 2 strikes of a weapon, displaying just how weak she is. Due to the new weakness of her sister, Quilaag is stationed where she is to defend her sister from any threats that would kill her. Regardless of the Chosen Undead's intentions, Quilaag never has solid proof that you won't kill her sister, explaining why she attacks you on sight. Quilaag's sister also assumes that you are Quilaag when you're interacting with her because she is blind and the Chosen Undead never speaks to her. Quilaag also just so happens to be in the way of the second Bell of Awakening, which further reinforces the idea that Bell Gargoyles do not reset or regenerate. It can be inferred that there were either more Bell Gargoyles or a simple guardian in place originally to protect the second Bell, but that Quilaag defeated them to inhabit the area for herself and her sister. Choosing this specific area of Blighttown also makes sense due to how forgotten the second Bell of Awakening is, meaning that it is an area where Quilaag expected to find a piece for her sister. There is a lot of material here to work with, but the story isn't quite as fleshed out and interesting as the other bosses, which makes me hesitant to push it up to B tier. The final boss in the C tier is again from the Lost Isolith, the Demon Fire Sage. The Fire Sage was a high-ranking official with close proximity to the Witch of Isolith and was supposedly the first being to be turned into a demon from the Chaos Flame. He is also known as the last mastery of fire sorcery. While the Fire Sage doesn't give us much to work with alone, he's placed here due to the existence of the Stray Demon, so I'll hold off on talking about the Fire Sage until I can go fully in depth with the other guy. Trust me, this guy's lore ends up being pretty interesting, with a similar story to the exiled first son of Gwen. Now we finally get to move into the B tier, and this is where it starts getting really good. The B tier can be thought of as generally the same as C tier, but with more developed and interesting lore. Kicking it off in 14th place is the good old Bed of Chaos. I want to restate that I don't care at all whether the design of the boss accurately represents the lore, I only care about the lore itself. And for this video, that means that the Bed of Chaos is effectively the Witch of Isolith. We're told 2 main things about the Witch of Isolith that independently add to her own story. The first is that the witch was one of the main forces behind the war against the everlasting dragons, and the second is that when the first flame began to fade, the witch attempted to recreate the first flame and failed, being consumed by the Chaos Flame with some of her daughters and becoming the Bed of Chaos. From there, we are told that the Bed of Chaos is the birthplace of all demons, although this is most likely just symbolism since we know that demons like Quilaag were not actually born directly from the location of the Bed of Chaos, and instead were turned into demons by being in the general vicinity. Most of the lore surrounding the Lost Isolith is expanded by all the other bosses previously discussed, but what's important is that the Bed of Chaos is the entity that represents the Chaos Flame, which is the cause of all the demons. Unfortunately, I find the story of the Witch of Isolith to be on the weaker end of the main game bosses. Maybe this is due to the development of the Lost Isolith being cut, but the story ends up feeling somewhat like a generic character succumbing to their own search for power trope. In 13th is the Four Kings, which is actually technically 12 kings, but we can pretend like that doesn't exist. What we know about the Four Kings is that they were entrusted by Gwen to receive part of the Lord's Soul and rule over New Londo. However, these Four Kings were corrupted by greed and accepted Cath's life drain power. Life drain is the act of making oneself stronger by absorbing the humanity of others. We also know that when humanity is completely depleted, all that's left is a hollow. Cath is the serpent attempting to appeal to humans' greed in order to break the cycle and usher in the Age of Dark. That means that the Four Kings are directly tied to showing what the Age of Dark might look like, which adds to the overall story of the world. Now at surface value, this sounds much like the story of the Witch of Isolith, where individuals succumbed to their conquest for power. In the Four Kings case, it would be a cliché of human greed leading to betrayal. However, the Four Kings are pushed higher than the story of the Lost Isolith due to the statue of Velka present in the Painted World. Upon closer inspection, we can actually find the same statue of Velka in New Londo. What this implies is that the Four Kings did not succumb to a lust of power at all, and were instead fully aware of what they were doing. If we take these statues to mean that the Four Kings and Velka work together, then the Four Kings turn from humans succumbing to greed into an elaborate plan to further the coming of the Age of Dark. Now that is pretty fucking cool. In 12th is Gravelord Nido. Like the Witch of Isolith, Nido found one of the Lord Souls within the First Flame and was a key player in the victory over the Everlasting Dragons. Afterwards, Nido returned to the Tomb of the Giants, where he continues to grow his following and harbor the Lord Soul. Where Nido's lore expands is with the Occult Rebellion, which appears to be a failed attempt from Velka to kill Nido or steal Nido's power, the Rite of Kindling. The Rite of Kindling is what allows the undead to have access to more Estus flasks, meaning it would be much easier to kill the gods with this in Velka's possession. Unfortunately, the amount of lore surrounding Nido is very little compared to most of the main bosses, with his role in the war and the ties to Velka being the only details we get about his story. However, speculations on how Nido came to exist in the first place are what pushes Nido up to this position. Nido's title is First of the Dead. He gained this title due to the world before the Age of Fire, where the world was ruled by everlasting dragons, and nothing ever died. However, due to proof that Gwen had an uncle in Allfather Lloyd, we know that non-dragon lifeforms existed during the Age of the Dragons. We also know that the dragons only refused to die due to their stone scales, and while they technically couldn't die due to those scales, they still aged traditionally. What this means is that while no beings could die, they could all waste away while not being granted death. When the First Flame appeared, every life form that teetered on the edge of this death would have all died simultaneously, meaning that Nido is in fact not one entity, but instead a collection of souls from every being that died during that event. As such, he was granted the title First of the Dead, not because he was the first to die, but because he is a collection of all of the first beings to die together. In 11th is Executioner Smo. Due to this fight being a gank boss, yet the two characters being so wildly different, I decided to split up Smo and Ornstein in my ranking, and Smo being the weaker of the two in terms of lore is fitted here. Smo was Gwen's executioner, and it's said that he loved being an executioner so much that he would smash the bones of his victims and eat them with his meals. Smo also had ambitions to be ranked as one of Gwen's 4 knights, but was never able to obtain that title due to his cruelty. When Gwen and his knights left to kindle the First Flame, Ornstein was tasked with staying behind and guarding Guinevere, and he gave Smo a chance to prove himself by granting him the same duty. We also know that Ornstein left his duty at some point to search for the first son of Gwen, but we'll get more into detail about that when we talk about Ornstein. What that means for Smo is that he either left when Ornstein did, and both the Ornstein and Smo we find in Anor Londo is an illusion by Gwyndolin, or that Smo chose to stay, and Ornstein is the only illusion of the two. There is also debate on whether Smo is even aware that Ornstein or Guinevere are illusions. I have my own thoughts on the answer for these questions. I believe that not only did Smo never abandon his post, but also that Smo is fully aware that both Guinevere and Ornstein are illusions. Based on his desire to become one of the 4 knights, and how Ornstein gave him the chance, it makes sense that Smo would happily defend at his post for the opportunity to impress the captain of the knights. Many people believe that Smo is jealous of Ornstein or hates Ornstein, and their evidence is the cutscene where Smo smashes Ornstein with a hammer to gain his powers, despite Ornstein's twitching fingers showing that he is still alive. However, I interpret this as Smo knowing that Ornstein is an illusion, and doing what he can to power himself up to complete his duty of guarding the throne. Whether you believe what I believe, or whether you think Smo took his chance to kill Ornstein out of hatred, or whether you think one or both or neither Smo or Ornstein are illusions, it's undeniable that Executioner Smo is an interesting and complex character who more than deserves his placement here. Being the first to break the top 10 is crossbreed Priscilla. Priscilla is a crossbreed who is part dragon. As the legend goes, she was casted into the painted world because of the abomination of her appearance. If the lie we are told about Priscilla is all there was to her lore, she would be C tier at best. However, it turns out that there is much more going on with Priscilla's exile than meets the eye. The first hint that shows that something might be wrong is that she is referred to as a bastard child and the antithesis to all life. This quote could be brushed off as a mere coincidence, but I interpret antithesis to all life as referring to Priscilla's life hunt power. Whatever life hunt was, it was so powerful that the gods were terrified, and they banished her not out of disgust, but out of fear. Why the gods would be scared of this power is most likely connected to Seath's search for immortality. It would make perfect sense for Seath to see this ability as a possible hindrance to his research and want Priscilla exiled as soon as possible. This makes even more sense when you realize that Seath is almost certainly Priscilla's father. Dialogue translations reveal that Priscilla is specifically labeled as a white dragon, and Seath is the only other dragon ever referred to by this description. We also know that Seath is obsessed with rebirth and studying women, which means that Seath most likely experimented with reproduction. This calls into question why Priscilla wouldn't simply be executed instead, but this is answered if the mother of Priscilla is Guinevere. Due to Priscilla being immortal, the mother must have been a god of Honor Orlando, and Guinevere fits the bill. If Priscilla was of royal lineage, then that would make sense why Seath lacked the political power necessary to have her executed, and would instead be forced to settle with banishing her to the Painted World, similar to how the first son of Gwen was also only banished. To add to the complexity of Priscilla, we are introduced to the concept of the Painted World for the first time, which adds a whole new depth to the universe of the Souls series, and ends up playing a key role in the endings of Dark Souls 3. The final nail in the coffin is Priscilla's unwillingness to leave the Painted World, even though it's blatantly obvious that Priscilla has long since discovered how to return to the original world if she desired. Due to the introduction of the Painted World, the potential signs that the world we inhabit is forever doomed, and the secrets behind her exile, Priscilla's lore ends up being much more than meets the eye. Coming in 9th is surprisingly the Stray Demon. Hands up if you expected this guy to make it this deep into the video. If you have your hand up, you're lying. To the majority of players, Stray Demon is a reskin of a reskin of a remodel of a boss in Demon Souls who was stuck in the starting area for cool factor. However, I was always interested in the lore implications of the Stray Demon being imprisoned, and figured that From Software probably wouldn't just throw him in there lazily. Turns out, Stray Demon potentially has A-tier levels of lore if all my theories pan out. The first question that needed to be answered was, why is he there? If you search for the answer, you'll be met with simple answers such as, maybe he's a spare for the Asylum Demon, or maybe he's just a Stray Demon who was put there because he's a stray. Or my personal favorite, that the Stray Demon and the Asylum Demon were lovers, but Stray Demon's boss Demon Firesage fired him and he got so depressed that he went stray. I think the answer is much more complex than that. As the legends say, Demon Firesage was the first to turn into a demon and the last to know fire sorceries. Although the sorceries faded upon turning into a demon, the pyromancy still remained with close proximity to the Chaos Flame. My theory is that this story is false and spread by the Lost Isolith in the same way that Gwen's family tends to spread lies. The Stray Demon's moveset is perfectly identical to the Demon Firesage, with the only difference being that the Firesage has more fire-looking attacks. However, the AoE explosions are clearly remnants of fire sorcery from the Firesage, and it's a contradiction that the Stray Demon knows these same tendencies, while also lining up with the supposed tale that Demon Firesage was both the first demon and the last to know fire sorcery. The Stray Demon is clearly using the same techniques, but to a lesser fated degree due to being further away from the influence of the Chaos Flame. What this means is that the Stray Demon not only had to have been from the Lost Isolith, but also had to be just as close in proximity as the Demon Firesage, and also a fellow master of fire sorceries. Where the story changes for Stray Demon is that he defected from the Witch of Isolith's cause to recreate the First Flame, and instead turned to Velka in ushering the Age of Dark. Upon hearing news of this betrayal, Stray Demon would have been wiped from the noble history of Lost Isolith, leaving only the Demon Firesage. This variation of the lore justifies numerous prior plot holes. Stray Demon has the same powers as Demon Fire Sage, but with a weaker presence of fire? Makes sense now. Stray Demon is located in the prison in which Velka hand-selects her chosen undead? Makes sense now. Demon Fire Sage's lore that were previously contradictory due to the existence of Stray Demon was just a fault of Front Software's lazy developers, despite them being known as a group of game developers that do everything they can to create tightly knit and detailed lore? Extremely hard to believe that. It's almost certain to me that Stray Demon is in fact not a lazy copy-paste with no lore, but instead a double agent for Velka's Age of Dark, who either infiltrated or defected from the cause of the Witch of Isolith, and was therefore erased from Isolith's history when discovered, and now takes refuge at an important location handpicked by Velka to find the Chosen Undead. Sadly, this is just a personal theory of mine, and I can't put Stray Demon above B tier until I'm absolutely sure this is a valid theory. Number 8, and rounding out the last of the B tier, is Sift the Great Grey Wolf. I'm torn on this one. My brain says Sif is a B tier, but my heart says Sif is an A tier. I put him as close to the middle of the two as I could. Without the DLC, Sif was Artorias' companion who stands in your way from receiving the Covenant of Artorias, which you need to ward back the Abyss during the fight with the two kings. Once you add in the DLC, the story gets 10 million times better. Artorias and Sif fought Manus together, but when it gets to the point where Manus will inevitably win, Artorias sacrifices a large amount of his remaining humanity to protect Sif. When we find Sif in the DLC, we can summon him in the battle against Manus and avenge Artorias' defeat. If we complete the DLC before fighting Sif in the main game, we're granted an extra cutscene where Sif recognizes us, but reluctantly decides to fight us anyway. This dedication to protecting the Covenant of Artorias reveals Sif's true intentions, which is to ensure that nobody else suffers the same fate as his old master. The fight is full of emotion and calls into question whether you're truly doing the right thing by progressing forward. In terms of the weight of the stories, this is definitely one of the more emotionally powerful bosses From Software has released. However, I'm reluctant to put this any higher because at the end of the day, Sif's lore is just an extension of Artorias' lore. Artorias has some of the most developed lore in the entire franchise, and this heavily amplifies the meaning of all four Knights of Gwen as well as Sif. However, if you take a step back and look at Sif's lore alone for what it is, I find it to be noticeably weaker in isolation than the bosses I have in A tier. We're finally in A tier, and this tier is reserved for the bosses that I believe completely dictate the lore of the game in an impactful and meaningful way. In 7th is Seath the Scaleless. I've already alluded to much of Seath's lore through multiple other bosses, but Seath still has a lot more to uncover. As the name would suggest, Seath is a scaleless dragon, which means he is not immortal like the rest of the everlasting dragons. Seath betrayed his own kind to help Gwen end the war, and was granted the title of Duke as well as a fragment of the Lord Soul from Gwen as an award. Driven by his desire for immortality, Seath committed his life to research, which involved countless experiments. The Pisaka, Moonlight Butterflies, Crystal Ember, and Crystal Golems were all products of his experiments. He also played a pivotal role in Priscilla's lore as discussed prior. At some point during his research, Sith realized that rekindling the flame would require his own death due to the ownership of the Lord Soul. Upon discovering this, he placed channelers on certain key areas as well as upping his experiments to kidnapping people and even other dragons such as Gaping Dragon, all in an attempt to stop the potential Chosen Undead from ever reaching him. Seath is blind, but can supposedly see out of the channelers that we encounter. A key factor of Seath's research was that it drove him mad. Not only was he driven mad, but due to his blindness, his chancellors had to read the research materials to him, which is why they are all hollow, as they were presumably driven mad as well. At the end of the day though, everything Seath worked for had a purpose, as Seath discovered the primordial crystal, which granted him the immortality he sought after as long as the crystal remained intact. With this much influence over a handful of the bosses in the game, as well as the detailed story of his intentions, Seath is a top contender for lore. However, he's placed at the bottom of A tier due to the vague nature of how he found the primordial crystal. For such a huge part of Seath's story, it's a shame that we never get to find out how Seath discovered the primordial crystal, nor do we ever get a detailed explanation on how the crystal works. In 6th place is Pinwheel. Pinwheel is directly tied to Gravelord Nido, and every interesting facet of Nido's lore is either directly involving Pinwheel or directly stemmed from Pinwheel. The tale of Pinwheel is the only other boss story in the game that could rival Sif in emotion. What we know about Pinwheel was that he used to be a normal human. However, due to some accident or event, both Pinwheel's wife and child passed away. Driven by his grief, Pinwheel sought to discover a way to reincarnate his loved ones. The solution came by joining Velka's quest to usher in the Age of Dark. More specifically, Pinwheel was interested in the Occult Rebellion, the plan led by Velka to steal Nido's power. As we learned from the description of the effigy shield calling the rebellion ill-fated, we know that Velka ultimately failed. Surprisingly, where the attempt of a goddess and her loyal followers failed, Pinwheel succeeded. Unlike the rebellion who tried to take the power by force, Pinwheel decided at some point to take an alternate route and instead befriended Nido by becoming a Gravelord's servant. After becoming a servant, Pinwheel showed enough loyalty and power that he was eventually seated directly at Nido's right hand. Nido's tomb in-game displays just how close Pinwheel got. It was through this deception that Pinwheel was able to steal the Rite of Kindling and flee to the catacombs. With Nido's power, Pinwheel began experimenting and researching a way to reincarnate his loved ones. We can see the fruits of his research when we find him. Countless books are scattered throughout the arena, and what's left of Pinwheel is a crippled and fragile abomination that can barely put up a fight. As it turns out, Pinwheel was able to successfully bring his wife and child back to life, but not in the way that he wanted. Something with his experiment went wrong, and the three are now grossly attached to each other. Pinwheel attempted to fix this new problem by researching the ability to separate in the hopes of his wife and child receiving their own individual bodies, which is where he's at when we find and kill him. The clones he makes during his fights are his attempts to separate, but we can see that he has yet to figure out how to truly separate all three. Maybe he would have eventually figured it out and his family could have lived in peace, but it wasn't meant to be. Pinwheel's lore and story are one of the best fleshed out stories in the game, with a boss fight and an arena that perfectly represent it, but at the end of the day, the story is somewhat isolated from the rest of the events of the game. After his ties to Velka and Nido are finished, he no longer has any significance to the rest of the plot, other than having ownership of the Rite of Kindling, no matter how well his story is developed. For that reason, I can't push him to the top of the lore rankings. In 5th, we have Gwen, the Lord of Cinder. Even though he's made it as far as he has, I feel like there will still be a lot of people who are upset to not see him higher. Gwen is definitely a fan favorite in the lore community, and for a good reason. Gwen was one of the 4 to discover the Lord Soul in the First Flame, and he was granted the title Lord of Sunlight. By using the power of lightning and sun, he ripped apart the scales of the everlasting dragons and played arguably the biggest role in ending the war. After the war, Gwen continued to hunt dragons along with his 4 knights, those being Artorias, Ornstein, Kieran, and Goff. As we already know, those 4 knights have some of the best lore in the series. Gwen also has ties to Havel, another very interesting character. Gwen also had the ability to split the power of his Lord Soul, a key fact that will greatly come in handy for a later entry. With this ability, he granted some of his Lord Souls to the 4 kings and Seath. He also attempted to wage war against the demons of Isolith at some point, but lost. As the First Flame began to fade, Gwen feared the Age of Dark and eventually decided that he would attempt to rekindle the First Flame on his own. This attempt ended up costing him all of his humanity instantly, leaving only a husk of what he once was. This is where his title changed from Lord of Sunlight to Lord of Cinder. His great power can be shown purely based on the fact that his hollowed form was able to survive after the rekindling. Not only is our character killed by rekindling after Gwen despite collecting all of the Lord Soul, but so is every other character we meet, including powerful beings such as Yorm, Aldrich, and the Abyss Watchers. The mere feat of surviving the rekindling was even pushed aside by Vendrick, who has his own solid argument for being the strongest canonical character in Dark Souls. Gwen ended up ruling over the Age of Fire and contributed lore through the children he had. One significant piece of this is the firstborn son of Gwen, who betrayed him and sided with the dragons, leading to Gwen exiling his own son and attempting to erase his existence. This piece will again come up on a different entry later in the list. All of this being said, as well as plenty that I don't have time to mention, I find Gwen's lore to be somewhat underwhelming. In terms of storylines in Dark Souls, the main areas are the Age of Fire and the Age of Dark. Gwen stands at the top of the Age of Fire, but personally I find the Age of Dark to be the much more compelling side of the lore. The ideas behind Gwen's fear of the Age of Fire ending, as well as the implication that the Age of Fire is a cycle doomed to repeat itself for all eternity, are very interesting by themselves, but they just don't stand up to the vast world of the Age of Dark for me, so I can't put Gwen higher than bosses that do embody the Age of Dark. Speaking of, now is a great time to talk about my 4th place entry, Manus, Father of the Abyss. Manus, while now a demon, was once the furtive pygmy, the last of the 4 to discover a Lord Soul in the First Flame. The story of Manus follows the city of Ulasil. As stated previously, Ulasil was being devastated by Black Dragon Calamity, and the people of Ulasil decided to find any source of power they could to save themselves from the dragon. This led to them taking the advice of a serpent, most likely Kath, to awaken the primordial man in the abyss. When traversing the abyss, they eventually found the furtive pygmy, which they tortured to the brink of madness. Once the humanity was almost completely depleted from the furtive pygmy, the power of the Lord Soul led the pygmy to not turn into a normal hollow, and instead become the embodiment of rage, Manus. Manus' rage was fueled by his desire to recover his broken pendant, which drove him so far as to reach across time and space to pull the player into the past when we stumble across the pendant in the future. As Manus expanded his search for the pendant, the influence of the Abyss spread with him, submitting all of Ulasteel to the Abyss apart from Dusk, who was saved by the player. Gwen, who was the champion of the Age of Fire, greatly feared the Abyss. He entrusted one of his knights, Artorias, to travel to Ulasteel and fight off the Abyss. Artorias and Sift attempted to fight Manus together, but ultimately lost, which leads to Sift's story in the present. It is ultimately the influence of Manus and the spreading Abyss that leads Gwen to make the ultimate sacrifice and rekindle the first flame. While Manus' story encompasses much of the Age of Dark, as well as ties together stories from the greatest bosses in the game, there are still some development issues. We are never given an explanation for how the furtive pygmy became Manus. We are told that he became Manus after he was driven to madness, and we also know that the pygmy has the power of a Lord Soul, but how exactly the pygmy turned into the demon like Manus while still retaining shreds of humanity is a contradiction. We are also never quite given an explanation for why Manus cares about the broken pendant so much. My best personal interpretation is that Manus had possession of the broken pendant while still a human, and therefore clings to the pendant as a last barrier of what remains before his humanity is completely depleted, but this again is just an educated guess. The final 3 bosses do not have stories that have the same minor flaws that Manus does. In third is Artorias the Abyss Walker. As we've already gone over, Knight Artorias was one of Gwen's 4 knights, and was tasked with pushing back the Abyss. In order to achieve this, he made a pact with one of the primordial serpents with the Covenant of the Beasts of the Abyss to traverse the Abyss safely. This is the same item that you need to kill Sift to obtain before fighting the 4 kings. Gwen also awarded Artorias the Silver Pendant, an item that allowed Artorias to travel the consumed Ulasteel without being overtaken by the Abyss. It's curious that Gwen was strong enough to survive rekindling the flame, yet was too scared to fight the Abyss himself despite having a pendant to do so. As the legend goes, Artorias died in the Abyss, but was able to defeat Manus and halt the expansion of the Abyss's influence. He is also the one credited with saving Dusk, the last evidence that Ulasteel ever existed. Upon playing the DLC, it is uncovered that Artorias actually did not defeat Manus and was corrupted by the Abyss that he fought to push back. After saving Sift, Manus was able to directly corrupt Artorias despite the Covenant and Pendant that Artorias had. It was actually us, the player, who defeated Manus, and also us who saved Dusk. Upon ending Artorias' suffering, we end up meeting Kirin, one of the 4 knights. By combining her dialogue with some cut dialogue from Goff and the location of Kirin's ring in the main game, we can infer that Artorias and Kirin were very close. What's interesting about Artorias' quest to push back the Abyss is that we have no solid proof of which serpent Artorias made the pact with. The obvious answer is that the pact was made with Frampt, as to mess up Kath's plan and stop the Age of Dark. It's also perfectly possible that the pact was an act of deception by Kath, who knew that Artorias would be corrupted by Manus, which would further the progression of the Age of Dark. The tale of Artorias is one of the most thrilling when playing the game, as we learn about one of the great heroes and his accomplishments, only to see his failures later on and being forced to kill him and finish his legacy ourselves. However, when it comes to Artorias' lore, this is about it. The lore that we have is tightly knit and dynamic, but surprisingly short. We're nearing the end of the list and there's only 2 bosses left. Of those 2, I see the penultimate boss in the boss lore ranking as Dark Sun Gwyndolin. In terms of bosses that have a direct influence on what the player does and why the player does it, no boss in any other From Software games comes anywhere close to Gwyndolin. Gwyndolin is a son of Gwen and was born with an affinity for the moon. He was raised as a daughter and has a feminine appearance. As for the last remaining god in Anor Londo, it's Gwyndolin's job to make sure the Age of Fire continues. It can be argued that Gwyndolin was actually the last god of the lineage who is still alive, but it can be debated whether Guinevere died randomly, or if Guinevere ended up playing a major role in the Kingdom of Lothric in Dark Souls 3. Regardless, Gwyndolin's job is to represent the Age of Fire, and he goes to unbelievable lengths to maintain this. Almost everything you see in Anor Londo, including the sun, is an illusion created by Gwyndolin in an attempt to convince everyone that the Age of Fire is just as powerful as ever. Underneath the illusion is the truth of the world, and with it, Gwyndolин's secrets to his connection with the Chosen Undead. As we already discussed, the Chosen Undead was originally a plan by Velka to kill all the gods and usher in the Age of Dark. Velka's original plan involved the Dark Moon Covenant, which was once led by Velka and not Gwyndolin. Upon Gwyndolin discovering Velka's intentions due to the failure of the Occult Rebellion, Velka fled to the Painted World where she continued her plan by working with the 4 kings. With Velka gone from Anor Londo, Gwyndolin took over the Dark Moon Covenant in secret. The Chosen Undead being handpicked from the prison and the different tests put in place to ensure the Chosen Dead were worthy are all from Velka, and there are even arguments that Velka is in fact the crow that carried you from the prison at the beginning of the game. Velka's goal was to create an undead so powerful that they could kill all of the gods, thus ending the Age of Fire. Gwendolyn took this entire system and kept it, but changed the mission of the Chosen Undead to becoming powerful enough to defeat Gwen and rekindling the flame, an ingenious tactic that built off of what Velka created while aiming to accomplish the exact opposite outcome. The connection between Velka and Gwendolyn is solidified through the Dark Moon Talisman and Velka's Talisman, each with opposing abilities to either cast miracles with intelligence or sorceries with faith. Everything you are told in the world, everything you fight, all of the illusions that you see were all carefully created by Gwendolyn to lead you down the path of the Age of Fire, and everything Velka worked for from behind the scenes to lead you down to the Age of Dark. The duality between Gwendolyn and Velka exactly mirrors the duality between Frampt and Kath. Gwendolyn's story also expands past Dark Souls 1 and into Dark Souls 3, where he plays a role in the lore of Aldrich, who then connects to the lore of Pontiff Sullivan, who is one of the greatest lore characters the series has ever seen. I find that Gwendolyn's story is not only perfectly knit, but that it also has a vast amount of detail, the biggest plot twist I've ever experienced in gaming, a gateway to the open-ended nature of which ending is correct, and influence across more than one game. Gwendolyn is most definitely an underrated character within the Souls series due to his simple and underwhelming boss fight, but his unmatchable lore is what allows him to stand above the others. Unmatchable except for my number 1 best lore in the game choice, and only S tier, Dragonslayer Ornstein. I covered a lot of the Ornstein lore in my SMO entry, but just to refresh, Ornstein is one of the 4 Knights of Gwen, and he was tasked with defending Guinevere in Anor Londo. It is also believed that Ornstein is the captain of the 4 Knights. Where I left off was that Ornstein left Anor Londo at some point to search for the first son of Gwen. It is said that Ornstein held a great deal of respect for the banished son, and that the son was Ornstein's teacher. This can effectively be interpreted as Ornstein valuing his loyalty to Gwen's son as higher than his loyalty to Gwen. This, combined with what we learned from Smo and Gwendolyn's illusions, is all we get from Ornstein in Dark Souls 1. I personally find that both Gwendolyn and Ornstein are the only 2 bosses in the entire game with compelling and sound stories, which justifies their placements as the top 2. It should also be noted that Gwendolyn and Ornstein both have continuations of their story across other Dark Souls games, but this is where the distinction between the 2 comes in. Gwendolyn's story was fairly complete. If you choose the optional route where you slay Gwendolyn, that's where his story ends. If you choose to leave him alive, then the only remaining question in his story is how he eventually dies. Dark Souls 3 answers this question by introducing new characters with new narratives, and finds a spot to incorporate Gwendolyn into the new lore. This is really cool, but also hints at some nostalgia and fan service tactics. Ornstein, on the other hand, has a compelling story with no holes in Dark Souls 1, but his story is continually fleshed out through Dark Souls 2 and 3 without the addition of more unintroduced characters. Through the events of Dark Souls 2 and Dark Souls 3, Ornstein receives a complete story from start to finish with basically no holes or contradictions within it, all with characters that we already know from Dark Souls 1 and Ornstein's original story. As we are aware, Ornstein left in search of the banished son of Gwen. We know that Ornstein held high respect for the son before he was banished. What this means is that either the story ends with Ornstein wanting to side with the son as a companion, or that he's seeking out the son to kill him for his betrayal. In Dark Souls 2, we are met with the Old Dragonslayer, an optional boss who resembles Ornstein. The distinction is that Old Dragonslayer has notably darker armor, and that he uses some dark-based attacks instead of just lightning. I argue that the Old Dragonslayer is Dragonslayer Ornstein, and for a few reasons. The first reason people point out is that Ornstein's soul drops from the Ornstein and Smo fight, which means that the Ornstein in Anor Londo is not an illusion. I counter this by referencing Gwen's ability to gift his souls to others, such as Seath and the Four Kings. This is further supported by the fact that it's noted that Ornstein's soul is special, and is a gift that the 4 Knights obtained directly from Gwen. I would argue that the 4 Knights all possess the potential to split their soul like Gwen does, with Ornstein being the most likely due to him being speculated as the captain. The point that Ornstein is an illusion is also reinforced by Smo's treatment of Ornstein in Phase 2 of the Anor Londo fight, which I already mentioned. If Smo wanted to join the 4 Knights so badly, and Ornstein gave him the chance to prove his worth, Smo has no reason to hate Ornstein and would most likely respect him more than any of the other knights or Gwen. If Smo knew Ornstein was an illusion, his actions make perfect sense. With that question out of the way, the only distinctions are the dark powers and the new color of the armor. I would suggest that the gray color of the armor could be attributed to one of 2 possible reasons. The first reason is that oxidized gold becomes dull as it ages. We know that due to the cycle of the Age of Fire, Ornstein has been roaming around for countless years, possibly thousands. In this time, the gold would have almost tarnished completely, discoloring it to what we see the Old Dragonslayer wearing. The other reason is that Ornstein's golden armor could have simply been a byproduct of the sun-based illusion Gwendolyn conjured, and that Ornstein's real armor was never gold to begin with. Both of these theories are reinforced by the Dragon Slayer set in Dark Souls 3, which is clearly a dull gray color indicative of oxidized gold. Then there's the question of the dark powers. Again, I have two potential reasons for why this might be present. The first and more simple reason is that Ornstein has been alive for countless years and would have learned new abilities. For those unsatisfied with that answer, I would point towards the story of Patches. While Ornstein is not undead, those with the god race can still be overcome by the Abyss over long periods of time, similar to how humans can lose humanity and Hollow. In Patch's story, we are proven that it's possible to succumb to the Abyss and then regain humanity and memories through the Purging Monument. For Ornstein, he would need a way to reverse the pull out of the Abyss that is taking over his body. We meet the old Dragon Slayer in the Cathedral of Blue, and defeating him has an item in the next area called the Cracked Blue Eye Orb. The item description reads that it is used to punish the guilty to strengthen the bond with your covenant. Of the covenants Ornstein could be familiar with, the Covenant of the Beasts sticks out like a sore thumb. This covenant was specifically formed as the legacy of Artorias and Sift, and was the covenant Artorias used while traversing the Abyss. We learn in Dark Souls 3 that the Abyss Watchers continue this covenant with the new name Covenant of the Old Wolf, which is a symbol to honor Sift, and the Abyss Watchers use this covenant to also ward off the Abyss while traversing it. Put all of this together and the picture starts to become more clear. Since Old Dragon Slayer is an optional boss, the timeline where you don't kill him would lead to the Old Dragon Slayer finding the Cracked Blue Eye Orbs, and using them to strengthen his bond with the Covenant of the Beasts, therefore successfully warding off his descent into the Abyss. Ornstein joining this covenant also reveals his true intentions with the banished son of Gwen. The son of Gwen sided with the Everlasting Dragons in the war, and therefore fought for the Age of Dragons. Both the Age of Dragons and the Age of Fire fear the Age of Dark. Ornstein abandoned the post Gwen assigned him to, implying that Ornstein turned his back on the Age of Fire. By joining the Covenant of the Beasts, Ornstein is actively fighting against the Age of Dark. What this leaves remaining is that Ornstein is devoted to the Age of Dragons, and is seeking the banished son not to kill him for his betrayal, but to join his former mentor. The fact that the old Dragon Slayer is still alive in Dark Souls 2 signifies that Dragon Slayer Ornstein has not yet failed his original ambition, countless cycles into the future. The story comes to its conclusion at Archdragon Peak in Dark Souls 3, where we find Ornstein's discarded armor outside of Nameless King's arena. Whether this means he finished his mission or died is something that the player doesn't know yet, but I have what I believe to be a solid idea of what happened. Due to the different lore implications we find in Dark Souls 3, as well as the fact that we have the ability to begin a transformation into a literal dragon, spells out the significance of Archdragon Peak. The area is a final destination for those seeking to become one with dragons or turn themselves into dragons. Within the Archdragon Peak, we can also find what appears to be a follower of Havel, or by some miraculous series of events, Havel himself. Remember that we already determined that it is possible to undo hollowing due to Patch's questline in the Ring City, so this option cannot be completely ruled out. We know that Havel himself was a sworn enemy to Seath, and we also know that Seath betrayed the Age of Dragons by fighting with Gwen. We can therefore assume that Havel himself could have supported the Age of Dragons much like Ornstein did. In Dark Souls 1, Havel was locked away in a cellar in the Undead Burg after hollowing, and it is said that he was locked away by a dear friend. While many speculate this to either be the blacksmith in Darkroot Garden or Gwen himself, I would offer up a third person, and that would be Ornstein. If Havel was the sworn enemy of Seath due to his betrayal of the Age of Dragons, then that devotion to the Age of Dragons would be more than enough to justify how Ornstein could be the dear friend. If this is correct, then it is in fact possible that the Havel we see in Archdragon Peak, that is seemingly observing a dead wyvern with respect, is the real Havel who traveled with the dear friend Ornstein after reversing his hollowing and going to Archdragon Peak together. At Archdragon Peak, the notable fight is the fight against the Nameless King, who the community has collectively decided is Gwen's banished son. Assuming this is true, and after piecing together 3 games worth of lore and relations, I think I can take a reasonable stab on what happened to Ornstein, so here it is. Ornstein found the banished son. The banished son is the Nameless King. Both of them side with the Age of Dragons. Ornstein made his way to Archdragon Peak to turn himself into a dragon so that he could fight alongside his mentor. Ornstein is the King of Storms. Now, I know that this is no new groundbreaking theory of what happened to Ornstein, but I do think that I've managed to connect more pieces and use more evidence to justify why the theory is reasonable than anyone else I've encountered. That's really all I've got for this video on Dark Souls lore, and it took a really long time to make, so I heavily appreciate everyone who stuck around and watched it all. Depending on how this goes and how I feel, I might consider doing this style of video for the other games in the series as well, so let me know in the comments if that interests all of you. I'm extremely tired now, so I'm ending the video, so here's the entire ranking. See ya.